It's week 20, day 2 of our Bible narrative reading plan. Today we begin in 2 Samuel, chapters 1 and 2. Now you notice that there's not a great transition between 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. They pause at a natural breaking of events with the death of Saul, but there is no transition or a prologue at the beginning of 2 Samuel because these were originally just one book. It's the book of Samuel, and so the story continues. It really just got divided up a long time ago because of the length of it, the length of the scrolls, the length of the book. But this is one continuing story. Now we're in 2 Samuel, what we call it, chapters 1 and 2. So we've seen that Saul has died, and we think, okay, great, now David, he can just be king. But is it that easy? We keep reading. We see that here in 2 Samuel 1, David hears the news of Saul's death. Someone comes to him, and he comes and lets us know that, hey, I had some kind of part with the death of Saul. Now, there's some discrepancy between what we see at the end of 1 Samuel and the beginning of 2 Samuel, and it lets us know that this guy is not completely telling the truth, if he's telling the truth at all. But he comes because he thinks that David will reward him for bringing about the death of Saul. But we see that's not David's response at all. David punishes this man for his wickedness in this event of the death of Saul. Whether he's lying, whether he had something to do with it, whatever's going on, this man is not being honest, and he pays the consequences for it. I love what one commentator said about this idea. He said that with the godly king David on the throne, crime doesn't pay. Under Saul's reign, that has not been true, but with David, we see that there's a new king in town. And Saul is dead, and David weeps greatly for him. He laments over him. David does not take pleasure in the death of even his enemy Saul. Even the one who pursued him and sought his death, David takes no pleasure in this. He doesn't view Saul as an enemy, and he gives a powerful lament here in the end of chapter 1. But now we see what's going to happen. Is David just going to automatically become king? Well, we see that it's not that easy. Israel is not quite ready just to name David king. Remember, Israel chose Saul. They used the wrong criteria, and they're not ready to make David their king. God speaks to David in chapter 2 and tells him to go up to the city of Hebron. And you will remember perhaps that this is the city of Abraham. This is where Abraham is buried. And so in a small way, it seems as if David is being reminded here, you are continuing in this great story of Abraham, the great story of God working in his people. And so the story continues here in chapter 2. David is anointed publicly as king. He's previously been anointed privately, but now he's anointed publicly as king over Judah. Not over all of Israel, but over the tribe of Judah. Now Ishbosheth, the remaining son of Saul, he is made king over the rest of Israel. And so it's going to be a few years before David is king over all of Israel, over united Israel. But right now, David is king over Judah. And we see that there's some people popping up here at the end of chapter 2 that are going to be important in the story. There's some fights that are popping up here in chapter 2 that are going to be important to the story. This is not a seamless transition to the throne for David. There's a lot of bloodshed involved. And we see here that Abner is mentioned. And you'll remember that Abner was Saul's uncle. And Abner was the leader of the army. And he's saying, look, even if Saul's dead, I'm going to keep this fight going. And so we see fighting here in the story. But we are also introduced to Joab. Joab is David's nephew. He's going to be important in the story. We're going to see these two men keep popping up. We're going to see them fighting. And we're going to see that grudges grow and arise out of what happens here in the end of chapter 2. So pay attention to that. But we also read today Psalm 110. Psalm 110 is a very important psalm. It is the most quoted psalm in the New Testament, particularly verse 1. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Now this psalm in its entirety is very important. Jesus makes reference to this psalm in the Gospels, and Jesus lets us know that David, even though this is a psalm of David, David knew he wasn't writing about himself. And we're going to keep seeing God's promises to David here in the book of 2 Samuel. God makes promises to David, but we understand that this king, this Lord that we're looking to, is not David, and it's not his offspring, it's Jesus. And so even as we see fighting taking place between David's lieutenants, all these people fighting as David is seeking to ascend the throne, one day, the king, the Lord, he will conquer all of his enemies. And we can take comfort in that. Here's a summary of today's reading. For more information, go to tunemyheart.org.